Before I start, I just want to read what the sign says. I'll read it very slowly. It says 속도를 줄이시오. 사고 많은 곳. All right, so let's break down the vocabulary and the grammar that we have in this sign. And the very beginning, actually, what I'll just say is we have really two or one kind of sentence, and this thing here, this line is actually, I guess you could say it's a sentence. It's a command, and there's a noun and there's a verb, so you can say this is a sentence. And then this thing here is not really a sentence. It's just sort of describing this whole thing. This top part here is describing this word. Whereas in this case, we actually have a noun followed by the object particle here, and then followed by a verb, and then followed by something that you can attach to make a command. So this side here is more of something that's actually an actual sentence, whereas this is just sort of describing this. And let's break down the whole thing. So first things first, this word here, 속도, this very simply means speed. This very simply means speed. And you're probably aware, this is used when you're referring to the object of a sentence. And this verb here, and we'll get to that in a second, but the verb here is 줄이다. Maybe I'll write that down now. The verb here is actually, the base form of this verb is 줄이다. And I'll talk about what's being added to it in a second, but this object particle is added to the object of the sentence to indicate that this verb is going to be acting on this noun, and it happens to be speed. So something's it's a command that's you're going to say, do this to your speed. Well, what are we doing? 줄이다 means to decrease. To decrease, or sometimes you could also say it would mean to lower. And there's something that I want to talk about with this, and one thing that another verb that you might see is actually 줄다. And what this means is 줄이다 would actually be an active verb that can act on an object, but 줄다 would be to be decreased. Or another way you can say it is to be lowered. And there's many different ways that you can say it, but those are two general ways you can say it. Something is some sort of maybe a number, or in this case you could see a speed or something like that is actively being decreased if I use this verb. And in this case, it was decreased, and a sentence might not necessarily say by whom it was decreased by, but we just know that it's being decreased. And I'll explain that a little more deeply. So we have some passive and active verb combinations that are like this. And I'll write down a couple of them up here. One very common one is the word 열다. And this means to be open, to open, the active form of opening. So this is an active verb. Maybe I'll just put that here to say that it's active. And another example would be 닫다. And this would be an active form of the verb to close. So in these two situations, you're talking about opening a door and closing a door. Now, there's also passive forms of each of these verbs. And I could also write, for example, the passive equivalent of 열다. The passive equivalent would be 열리다. And this would be to be opened, to be open. And 닫다 also has a passive form, and that would be, in this form, it's 닫히다. This is to be closed. And I talk about all this in lesson 14, where I talk about passive verbs and how they relate to active verbs. And there's different sort of types of passive verbs and active verbs. And I'm more specifically talking about these, what I call non-하다 ones, where here's another situation where you have 켜다, which is to turn on, and 켜지다, which is to be turned on, and 끄다, which is to turn off, and 꺼지다, which is to be turned off. And this is the example I showed you earlier. 닫다 is to close, and 닫히다 is to be closed. And what we see is you have an active form of the verb, and then you have a passive form of the verb. You have an active form of the verb, and you have a passive form of the verb. Now the active form of the verb, as we see here, because this is the active form of the verb here, what we see here, the active forms of these verbs can act on an object. They can act on, so I'll write that down here, act or can act on an object. And when I say object, I mean literally, if you're talking about Korean grammar, literally something that has that on it. So for example, I can say, if I wanted to use these two active verbs here, I could say, and again, the subject of the sentence, it could be anything. It could be I or you or anything like that. It doesn't matter what comes before here. But I could say 문을 열다, and that wouldn't be a conjugated verb, but this is the base form of the verb. And 문을 열다 would mean to open the door. And I could also say 문을 닫다. And again, this is not conjugated, but this is just the base form of what this would be. And again, if this was I back here, the subject of the sentence was I, this would mean I open the door and I close the door. And 닫다 and 열다 are active forms of verbs that are actually able to act on an object. And again, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing an active form of the verb being able to act on an object. But these, if I'm talking about these passive verbs, they can't act on objects. And if you're talking about Korean grammar, what that means is they cannot be placed in a sentence where they're acting on something that has this r or on it. So for example, you could not say 문을 열리다. You could not say 문을 열리다. You would not be able to say that. That would not be correct, because again, to be open is sort of saying is saying that something's already open, but this is saying that it's open. And again, I can't even really explain what this means, because it doesn't even make sense in my head. Instead, what you need to do is say that the door is open by doing this. Now, and again, this is not conjugated, but what you're saying here is the door is open, and you don't have like a person back here saying I, for example. You can't say the door is open. Instead, what you could say, and I talk about this over on this side, you have to say, I open the door. And in this case, you have an object. And again, if you had I back here, for example, 나는 or 저는, you had some sort of subject back here, you can say, I actively open the door. But in this case, you wouldn't be able to have something like I or you or him or some sort of subject back here, because you can't say the door is open, and then it doesn't make sense. So what you have to do is, the door is actually the subject of the sentence. The door here is the subject, and you're saying that the door is open. And likewise, you could do the same thing with 닫히다, and you can say, so for example, if you want to say the door is closed, you can say 문이 닫히다. And anyways, the only reason why I'm talking about this in this lesson is most of the time, and I actually say this in this particular lesson here, and actually I say it right here, most of the time, when you look at these active verbs and comparing them to their passive equivalents, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the active form of the verb is shorter, and when I say shorter, I mean less syllables, shorter than the passive form of the verb. So in this case, you have 열다, and then the passive one is 열리다. You have one additional syllable here. And then same thing here, you have 닫다, and then the passive form is 닫히다, and you have one additional syllable. And there's other examples, like for example, you can have, as I showed you before, you can have 끄다, which means to turn off, actively to turn off. But then you could also have the passive form, which is 꺼지다. And again, here's the active form that has two syllables, and this is the active form that has, the passive form that has a sort of an extra syllable. But there's some cases where actually the active form and the passive form, the active form is actually longer, just like you see here, and the passive form is actually shorter. Now, this is a situation where we have that. Where the active form of sort of this active passive verb equivalent that we have here, the active form is actually a syllable longer than the passive form. And unfortunately, there's no real way to memorize which one is ever an active form and which is a passive form. It's something that you sort of have to study, and you can't really know it unless you have studied it before. And luckily, I've studied the fact that, I know that these two are passive verbs, and I know that these two are I know that these two are active verbs, and I know that these two are passive verbs. And because of that, again, as I said, these cannot act on objects, and these cannot act on objects. And again, I've also luckily studied that this is a passive verb and this is an active verb. And unfortunately, like I said, there's no real way of knowing this unless you've specifically studied it before. So all that gets me to the fact that this is an active verb, but I could make a similar sentence. I could make a similar sentence if I wanted to say, for example, let me go back to my purple. I could make a similar sentence or something like that. If I wanted to use this passive equivalent, I could say 속도. Let me say what you can't do first. 속도를 줄다. You wouldn't be able to say that because in this case you have this passive verb that cannot act on an object, and this in this case is saying that this is the object of the sentence. Well, passive verbs can't act on objects, so instead what you'd have to do is say that it's instead of saying I decrease my speed, what you'd have to do is just say and put 속도 as the subject of the sentence. Say 속도가 줄다. And again, you can maybe say it in the past tense and say 줄었다, and say that the speed was decreased. Well, how was it decreased? And when was it decreased? And where was it? Well, we don't know that. This is just saying that the speed was decreased, and we don't know who did it. Maybe maybe by context it would have happened in a previous sentence that you know who decreased it, or maybe the context will tell you later. But this is just saying that the speed was decreased, and it's not really giving you any information on who, what, when, where, or how it was decreased. It's just saying that the speed was decreased. So anyways, all that gets me to the fact that I have, and let me change my color so we can see a little bit better here. I have a noun, 속도, and this is the object marker saying that a verb is going to be acting on this object. And the verb is to decrease, to actively decrease, and I'm actively going to be decreasing my speed. And shio is a way to make a command. And it's a way to you attach it to a verb to indicate that you want the listener to do that particular verb. So in this case, what you're actually specifically adding is you're adding she, and if the verb actually ended in a consonant, in this case the verb actually, I can shoot it out, the stem ends in a vowel, but if the verb ended in a consonant, you would have to add this as well. Sorry, let me write that somewhere else. You'd also have to add this as well. So you could add this if the verb ended in a consonant, and you'd only just add this if the verb ends in a vowel, which is in this case is what we're doing. So you don't, like for example, if you were going to add shio to something that ended in a consonant, you'd have to add this instead. But anyways, this verb stem only ends in e, so we're only adding this. We're only adding this one. And again, this just is one way to make a command. There are other ways to make a command, and I talk about that. I've actually talked about it in another sign video. But again, if you wanted to, another way to make a command is to add this. Another way to make a command is to very commonly add seo. And there's a lot of different ways, but probably the most possible formal way that you can make a command is to add this thing. And specifically, this is being used on a sign because it's sort of the government, and the government was the one who made this sign, is directing this command at the general public. And that's generally a case where you'd want to be in a very, very formal or use very, very formal speech. So that's why we have this formal command here. I don't recommend that you use this command in your everyday speech. Instead, I would highly recommend that you use this one or this one, or you could also use this one and add yo to it. But again, this shio is a very, very formal way to make a command, and I wouldn't recommend that you use that all that often. Let's go to the second side of this sign, and it very, very simply, 사고 means accident. Oh, and actually, even before I get to this, let's sort of understanding fully what this side means will probably lead us into understanding what this side will actually mean. So speed, decrease, and a command saying do this verb. So all in all, this would say decrease your speed or lower your speed. Okay, great. Now in this side, again, 사고 means accident. 많다, again, the base form of this, it's an adjective, and 많다 and it means many, or I guess the full version would be to be many. But if you add this or this to an adjective, for example, you can have 행복하다, 행복하다, and that's to be happy. But if you add this to 행복하다, you get 행복한. And that allows me to describe an upcoming noun. And that's what I have here. I have 많다, but I removed 다 because I'm talking about the stem, and this is the stem. And I add this to 많다. So that's, again, in this case, I have to choose if I'm going to be adding this or if I'm going to be adding this. And in this case, you add this if the stem ends in a vowel, which 행복하다 did. This is the final vowel in the stem, so I add 행복한 in this case. But with 많다, it ends in a consonant, so I add this to it. So that's why I have man, and then following man, I have un. And again, what this allows me to do is it allows me to describe an upcoming noun. So what I have is accident, many, and it's kind of hard to translate this without knowing this final noun here. And this final noun means place or location. Location. So what this means is this is a place where there is many or a lot of, you could also say manta means a lot of, I'll write that down, a lot of, this is a place where there are a lot of accidents. And that makes perfect sense. And these two sort of lines, this line here and this line here, sort of fit together perfectly. So this is saying decrease your speed. And specifically, why do you want to decrease your speed? Well, this is actually a place where a lot of accidents happen. So that would make logical sense that you'd want to decrease your speed in a place where lots of accidents would happen. I actually took this picture not on a road, but actually on a bike path, and it was specifically on a part of the path where there was a very, very sort of, it was right on the Han River, so people generally went really, really fast, and there was also a big stream that also had bike paths. Sort of, and the bike path here and the bike paths here and the bike paths here were all sort of connecting, and the sign I sort of found it right here and also right here, telling both sides, like, look, you better be decreasing your speed because this is a big high collision, high accident place. So make sure that you decrease your speed if you're going into this intersection here. Well, that was fun. I hope you learned a lot.